Hi, welcome back to Vote for Vermont. I'm Ben Kinsley. Our normal host, Pat McDonald, is out today, and so I'm filling in. And with me today is Ben Brown, who's the founder of New Grassroots. So Ben, thank you for being here.
Yes, appreciate it.
Yeah, so it's exciting topic. We're going to cover a variety of different things. So first, we always like to ask our guests to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about who they are and how they arrived here and doing what you're doing. So kind of what's your story?
Cool. So I grew up in Rutland. I am from a large family, so I'm one of 9 children. Moved to South Burlington in 2010, so I left for a while. I was in Colorado for about 10 years. Moved back to Vermont in 2010 to get into farming, regenerative farming, so kind of soil-based farming.
Right.
Raising chickens, actually, as a way of managing soil, distributing nitrogen, sequestering carbon, and eventually became pretty active in the agriculture community. So I was a board member for the Vermont Grass Farmers Association for a couple years.
Cool.
And then also became a board member of the Vermont Farmers Food Center, which is a food aggregation and storage hub in Rutland.
Okay. And what do they do? They're kind of like a kind of a food shelf type of thing that's run by farmers, or how's that?
Yeah, so it's a 3-acre facility that has a really large building that used to be a steel building many decades ago, and it's been repurposed to house the indoor farmers market in Rutland.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, it's about 80 vendors that have spots. And then there's also a healthcare share program where they work with the local hospital and essentially prescribe vegetable shares to some of the patients.
Interesting.
And then the Vermont Farmers Food Center acts as a central hub to facilitate those programs, aggregate the food, and distribute it to the community. So it plays multiple roles in the community, but it's very much farmer driven. So it's really all about giving small farms the infrastructure and ability to aggregate their resources, and they're moving in a direction of doing food storage as well. So dry storage and frozen storage. So yeah,
cool.
it's a really exciting program, similar to the food hub in Hardwick.
Okay.
So kind of following that model, but adapted for the southern Vermont farmers.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the Hardwick one. I think it's a really interesting concept. It's kind of an interesting mesh between like a farmer's market and a community garden type situation, and also like a food shelf essentially. So it's kind of
and then they also provide like a commercial kitchen.
Yeah.
So small farmers, or even someone who's not a farmer who wants to start a value-added business to take local products, add value, and then resell them retail. There's a commercial kitchen in Hardwick as well as in Rutland. So they have a commercial kitchen they rent out to local people if you want to come in and bake pies or whatever, and then sell those. So really it's about kind of relocalizing the production of food, fuel, and fiber. And that's something I've been very passionate about since moving back to Vermont. And to kind of step back to add context, from 2006 to 2010, I ran a foreclosure consulting company in Denver. So at the end of 2008, when the mortgage industry collapsed,
of course, yeah, I
was kind of in the belly of the beast, negotiating foreclosure properties with the lenders, which was it was tough. There was, I got a kind of a front row seat at the human calamity produced by the banking sector collapsing. So that actually led to me choosing to become a farmer. I kind of wanted to take a different direction in life. And about that time, I became aware of permaculture and regenerative farming, and I was just, inspired. Asked my now wife if she wanted to live in Vermont. She's from Oklahoma originally, and luckily, she totally wanted to. It's a real great culture fit for us. So I moved back to my home state in 2010, got into farming, and the farming is what actually led to this current project, New Grassroots, on the civic engagement side.
Yeah, which is very cool. And so how did you arrive at New Grassroots?
Yeah.
And it seems like it was really born out of a level of activism where you're getting involved in your local community, and you're trying to find better ways to do that. So explain
Absolutely.
a little
Yeah.
bit to us how that whole
Sure.
thing happened.
So when I came back and started getting into farming, the goal is to start a small, diversified homestead and a business. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. So I started with chickens and wanted to build on top of that agricultural business with some other endeavors. And what I ended up kind of discovering is that it's very difficult for a small, diversified farm to compete price-wise with the really massive farms that are these kind of international, industrialized farms that, because of the scale that they operate at, can really undercut small farmers. That also gets into subsidies. A lot of these large farms have lobbied for massive subsidies, so it's a little bit anti-competitive. And I, as someone new to agriculture, I really wanted to start a business, and I realized, wow, I'm gonna spend all these years trying to build a farm, and I'm just never gonna be able to compete in the market. So I learned about regulations and how laws often impact what types of business models can compete and can't compete. So I realized I had to start paying attention to the laws and the legislation in our state in order to mold my business around those regulations to try to be competitive.
Right.
And that's what really got me into being civically engaged. So I started volunteering with some local ag organizations and paying attention to laws impacting small farms. So things like being able to produce raw milk on your farm and sell that, on-farm processing, which is something we've done. We process all our own chickens on the farm. We raise chickens for meat primarily. Yep. So we do all our own processing, put them in the freezer. So that experience, discovering the role regulations play in how a business model can be shaped, is what led me to get involved in civics, essentially, and to learn about how a bill becomes a law and how the whole process works. And from that experience, it really led me to a broader issue of money in politics. And that's kind of a hot button phrase that most people recognize these days. But essentially it refers to the fact that if you have a lot of money, you can lobby politicians and potentially get favorable laws as a result of that lobbying.
Right.
So I started paying attention to this, realizing I don't have money to lobby. How does a citizen activist counteract that type of influence? And this is what really got me into grassroots organizing, because the reality is, especially in Vermont, when enough people get fired up about something and get vocal and really target those efforts at an actionable law, people can really still make change politically. And again, to qualify that, I think at the state level, that's especially true. It's very difficult to move a law at the national level.
Absolutely.
Because it's such a beast of an ecosystem. So I started getting active in Vermont on this issue of money in politics. So in 2014, I ended up leading a statewide organizing effort to pass a resolution, which was JRS 27. It called for an Article 5 constitutional convention to overturn Citizens United and get money out of politics. And to me, that was kind of a broader approach to addressing the structural problems I discovered through the agricultural interest. So Vermont in 2014 passed first in the nation legislation that called for this convention to get money out of politics. And in that experience, I learned some really interesting things about grassroots organizing. In particular, we had several key legislators that we needed to get on board. And we approached them in person and kind of made our pitch. And they essentially said, I'm not interested in this right now. And we said, okay. And we organized in their district and started asking voters in that district if they'd be willing to call their legislator and support the bill. We had good success with that methodology and produced a lot of phone calls to key legislators and ended up hearing from those legislators and saying, hey, listen, my constituents obviously care a lot about this. Let me learn more about that issue. So we kind of sat back down with them and ultimately got several key legislators on board with our initiative, folks who had previously told us they weren't going to support the bill.
Right.
So as someone pretty new to grassroots organizing, that was actually really inspiring to me, that if enough Vermonters care about something and choose to make a personal phone call to their legislator, Vermont legislators are interested in hearing from their constituents, and that actually does impact their vote, which ultimately impacts policy outcomes. For me, that was like really cool to recognize as a grassroots organizer, you can help influence change. And that was part of the impetus for New Grassroots. So the kind of other side of that was during this organizing effort, I was trying to track all the phone calls I was generating to each legislator. And I realized that the State House in Vermont actually does not keep track of how many Vermonters call each legislator.
Which shocks me. I've wondered about this. So, leading a statewide advocacy organization, and I've been involved in advocacy and grassroots organizing in Vermont for several years. And it amazes me that we're still in a world of analog telephones. You have to call the State House, and then they take that message. You can't even get to a legislator. You call the front desk, essentially.
That's right.
The sergeant at arms office. They write down on a sheet of paper what the message is and who it's from, and then give it to a 10th grader to go find the legislator in the building somewhere and hand them the piece of paper.
That's right.
I can't tell you how many times you're sitting in committee meeting and one of the legislative pages walks in and I'm looking for Senator so and so. And they have to find and this is the system that we have to contact our legislators. You don't know if they actually read the message. You don't know if they read it and then tossed it in the trash can and never thought of it again. And most of the time they just take it and stuff it in a pocket somewhere, right? So how do you know? Well,
it's fascinating. So yeah, if you sit in the chamber, often you'll see these legislative pages distributing these notes one at a time. They're pink carbon copies from a handwritten note referred to as pink slips, and you'll see 2 stacks on a legislator's desk, I assume, for and against whatever bill they're dealing with.
Maybe they have different pockets.
It's like, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating because I'm sure they all kind of have their own unique methodology of how they track that or count it or tally it.
Or don't track it.
Or don't, which would be super fascinating to know is how each legislator thinks about those communications. But yeah, I mean, I have pictures of the trash can at the State House full of pink slips, which are constituent contacts from Vermonters. So that really struck me. So on one side, I'm really inspired because when Vermonters call their legislators, it can totally make a difference on how the legislator votes. But on the other hand, there's really no data indicating what popular opinion in any district is. So there's essentially no data to cross-reference against legislators' voting records to tell whether the voting record matches up to the popular opinion in the district.
So essentially what you're saying is a legislator can say, I heard X, Y, and Z from my constituents, like I got an overwhelming number of phone calls or emails on this issue telling me to vote one way or another, and they don't have to produce any proof of that.
They can't.
Yeah.
So it's almost even better for them.
Right.
Because it's not like they have the data and they're not publishing it. The data doesn't exist because no one's aggregating that data. So maybe if a legislator is very detail-oriented, they actually keep track of every single communication.
Yeah.
And certainly there's many ways to communicate these days, whether it's social media, email, phone calls directly to the legislator, phone call to the sergeant of arms office, bumping into your legislator at the grocery store, which I hear happens often in Vermont.
It happens quite a bit.
Yeah, which is great. But again, from the voter perspective, how do we have a high-level view of what each other thinks on specific issues? And how does that impact policy outcomes?
Right.
So that's really kind of what I realized in my role as a grassroots organizer working on JRS 27 to deal with money in politics. I essentially discovered some higher-level structural deficiencies with our system. And to your point, it's like this is the digital age. So I conduct all my day-to-day business on email. Everything's digital. But when it comes to the extraordinarily important component of society, which is politics and how we administer politics, it's all analog still.
Right.
So to me, that was actually an opportunity. So it was painful to deal with because I had to do all this data entry on spreadsheets, and I would ask a Vermonter to call their legislator. I would have to call them back another time. If they ever answered the phone, I would ask, did you call? Was the phone answered? What was said? and what's the follow-up? And that just turned into an extraordinary amount of data entry, which was almost a disincentive to organizing.
Right.
For instance, what if I walk into a room where 100 people are willing to help our issue? I'm going to have hours upon hours of data entry just to know whether those folks actually engaged or not. So as an entrepreneur, as a millennial, I claim millennial. I was born in 1980, which is the earliest year possible.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's on the
I'm like on the cusp,
Yeah.
but I think like a millennial,
Yeah,
although I don't
totally.
have much hair in my head.
Hey, I know plenty of millennials that don't have hair.
You
so,
know,
yeah, it's
so
okay.
that's why I give a beard too.
Yeah, you gotta
Compensate.
Yeah, but I think it's so interesting because there are study after study that indicate the most effective contact for a legislator to influence a legislator's opinion is a face-to-face meeting.
Yep.
And I can collaborate that, having worked in the industry. There's nothing that beats having a face-to-face conversation with a legislator.
Sure.
Narrowly behind that is having a phone conversation.
That's right.
That is the next best thing. And then you can go to email and social media and traditional letter if you want.
Sure.
But a phone call is so much more effective. If you can't get there in person, which is the best option, and there's a lot of reasons why normal constituents can't go to Montpelier and track their legislator down. That's a time-consuming proposition, right?
Which gets expensive if you got to
Which
take
gets
time off
expensive.
of work.
To time off of work, you
Daycare.
got to drive 3 hours. You got to put gas in your car. You got to find parking, which in Montpelier during the legislative session is not easy to do. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of barriers, right? But the phone call is almost as effective as an in-person meeting. Way more effective than an email. Way more effective than social media, or even a handwritten letter. Yet so few people utilize that as a mechanism. There's so much fear around placing a phone call now, and it's interesting because the email is just so much easier to plug. But I can tell you, legislators get so many emails every single day, and you got to also remember it's not just their legislative emails that they're getting contacts through.
Right.
These people have full-time jobs.
Right.
And, we have a part-time legislature in Vermont.
Yep.
So they're getting work emails while they're in the State House. They're getting personal emails while they're in the State House. And then they're getting their constituent contacts. And unless it's something like a donor or someone who's a really big community member, chances are they're probably not giving your email a whole lot of attention. Versus where if you got them, at their local grocery store, or if they got them on the phone, they're going to pay more attention to that contact. And that's why that's the holy grail for advocacy organizations is how many phone calls can you get? Because phone calls are what really do, change the narrative. And then you saw that even at the federal level with this past year with the healthcare debate.
That's right.
A flood of phone calls. So I think that concept is really interesting. How do you make it easier for organizers? How do you hold your public officials accountable and also give them the tools to defend themselves if they are actually on the same page as their constituents and they can prove it? So I think it's a really interesting problem to solve. And how do you get people to get over that initial hesitation to pick up the phone and call a legislator? Because that's how changes happen.
Absolutely. And that's a decision that happens internally inside of voters.
Yeah.
So how do you inspire people? It's interesting. There's some good studies that have been done. One is from Google, a study that was done in 2015 that looked at, I think, almost 700 people they polled, and they asked folks why they do or don't participate. And they essentially identified a demographic of all eligible voters called the interested bystanders. And this is about half of all eligible voters who choose not to participate. And they kind of dug into that. Why don't folks participate? And they refer to them as interested bystanders because they qualified that they are interested in politics. So they read articles about politics. They have personal conversations with friends and family about politics. They might even like and share social media posts about politics. But they don't do anything measurable or effective, and they don't feel that the actions they're taking are effective in any way. And
they're okay with that, which is the interesting piece that I find.
Well, so it's fascinating because a lot of folks reported that they would do something else if it could be proven that it made a difference. And then there were some reasons of why they didn't contact their legislator. And to your point, one of the reasons is because folks are worried that if they speak to someone in person, that person is going to debate them. And people are already insecure about contacting their legislator, and they're really hesitant to get into a debate or a conflict on some sort of policy position. Essentially, folks want to voice their opinion, and they don't want to use that forum as a place to really debate the finer points of any policy.
And oftentimes they probably feel like maybe their legislator is better able to engage in a debate than they are. That could be part of the reason.
100%.
You know, it's interesting because one of Newton's laws of thermodynamics is bodies at rest tend to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. So, and it's kind of true in human psychology also. It's a lot easier to keep doing nothing.
That's right.
Until something convinces you to take an action. Some energy input convinces you to take an action.
Absolutely.
And then the people that are engaged tend to stay engaged. You know, people that are, and that's like 1% of the population, but those people are the ones that are out there knocking on doors, calling their legislators, waving signs, and they do it for multiple issues.
Ongoing,
On an ongoing basis. Yeah.
Personally motivated people. And in the context of democracy, it's interesting because democracy, decisions in democracy aren't made by all eligible voters. They're made by people who show up to play ball. So, we have a situation where you can have a vocal minority essentially overwhelming the silent majority. So this, again, really kind of gets at the nuance between polling the public and effective participation.
Right.
So one of the key distinctions between those two comes down to identity. So the identity verification of the person participating. So if you do like a change.org petition or some other method where the identity isn't really validated, often legislators will say, hey, this is great, but I don't know who of these folks are my constituents.
Right.
And that certainly plays in, as it should, to their decision. So one thing that we try to do, one thing New Grassroots does do, is limit constituent communications to only the voter and their own legislator.
Right. They can't. A voter can't contact someone who's not their legislator.
Exactly.
And interesting because you mentioned this, but I think I would like to revisit it.
Sure.
Where you talk about survey data, and survey data is a great tool. Advocates use it all the time.
Absolutely.
I've used survey data. But you're right, there is always a hesitation with survey data because it's hard to validate it. Even for organizations like change.org that you need a unique email address for every signature petition, so that avoids a bot going in and getting 10,000 signatures. But even in situations like that, there's no identity verification where you can go in and say, yes, these are actually the results, and oh, by the way, we can tell you all the demographics of here's how it broke down without a scientific survey.
Right.
The online petitions that everyone loves to use,
right,
because they're convenient,
they're
quick, they're easy to do, but you don't have the identity verification piece
That's
of
right.
it. So and one of the potential side effects of that I think is that actual verified survey data done by professional polling institutions is kind of becoming a casualty of that, where that data is becoming less valuable because it's being polluted by less rigorous online survey data.
Absolutely.
So I think it's interesting that that's a piece that you really focus on in your platform, is having that personal identification and then verifying it to the individual legislator.
100%.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of the benefits of going voice versus just an email. So there's a bio-encryption security component, whereas each of us has a very unique voice. So that becomes a component of the identity verification, which becomes very difficult to commit voter fraud via voice message.
Right.
So that factors in. And going back to your other point about why voice, or how voice is better than just email, I recognize the inherent elitism in any sort of technical solution. So I don't think that technology is going to provide some utopian solution. I don't believe that at all. It just produces efficiencies that, if incorporated into other tools and mechanisms, can be a better way of doing something. So 30% of Vermont still does not have access to dependable high-speed internet. about 30%. And so with a voice message-based system, we allow anyone who has access to a touch-tone telephone to operate through our system, contact their legislator on specific legislation, and have a voice, whereas we can still track those messages sent through just a telephone. So now there's two primary interfaces that folks can use to contact their legislator: our website, where you can record a voice message and send it, or just a 1-800 number that we're going to roll out in 2018.
So this might be a good time to actually tell our viewers what exactly your system is and what it does, how it functions. And it's fairly intuitive. I've ran through it a couple times. I've seen the back end of it, and I think it's a great concept. But you can just kind of lay out for us how it works. Like if you're a user going in there and you want to contact your legislator, how does it work from a user experience?
So you go to newgrassroots.com, and you're able to enter your email address and your zip code and begin the sign-up process. And then that leads you through a 4-step process where we gather your physical address, which is what correlates with your legislative district, your email, your phone number, and your name, essentially. And it's completely free. So when you complete that sign-up process, you're brought to your homepage dashboard. The primary focus of the application is to send voice messages that support or oppose active legislation. So it's all based around legislation. So you either search for legislation, if you don't already know the bill you're trying to take action on, or if you do know the bill, you enter the bill ID up into a little box. So you would go to the record message page on your dashboard, and then it'll ask for the bill ID, and you enter the bill ID, which is S123 or H456.
Right, which are the designations whenever a bill gets drafted. It always gets a designation.
That's right.
Both for the either the House or the Senate, so it's an H or an S, and then the draft number of the bill. So 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6, or whatever it is.
Yep, exactly.
And that's how you identify a bill as it's moving through the legislature.
Yep, it's this kind of formal name.
Yeah.
So you enter the bill ID, and then you choose support or oppose, and then you designate one of your legislators. So we offer limited options based on your physical address.
So it pre-selects what legislators are in your district.
Correct. It's the only option you have.
Right. So you basically it pulls up all the legislators that you are a constituent of.
Exactly.
Based on your physical address.
Yep.
Correct. Yeah.
So you might have one or more senators, and generally one rep. I think there might be a couple districts that have more than one rep. So a handful. Chittenden County, there's 5 senators or 6.
7.
Is there 7 now?
I believe so.
Yeah, it's a lot. So depending on your district, you'll have a certain number of options. So yeah, you've designated the bill ID, you support it opposed, you choose one of the legislators who this personal voice message will be delivered to, and then you click a little button that says, call me now. And this is kind of, our nifty little technology. Our website actually places a phone call to your phone number that we've collected during the sign-up process. So you receive a phone call, and there's a little automated system that says, hello, thanks for calling your legislator to support or oppose this bill. So it kind of repeats back to you what you're taking action on. And it says, please record your 1-minute voice message. So we do cap all voice messages at 60 seconds because we want to encourage legislators to actually consume these voice messages. And we understand that they're busy folks. And if we allow voters to kind of ramble on for minutes and minutes, it's actually going to devalue that communication.
Right. So if you get 10 messages that are each 10 minutes long, well,
Yeah. We don't, and the thing that we don't want to do is add workload to legislators.
Right.
We're trying to provide value to legislators to kind of bring their workflow into the modern digital age to help them. It's pretty amazing, but Vermont legislators aren't offered a whole lot of tools. If you're a brand new legislator and you're onboarded,
you get an iPad and an email address.
You get an iPad, an email address.
That's it.
I don't even know if they have like a constituent relationship management software that gives them a list of their constituents.
No, they've got nothing.
Yeah. No. So it's we're not necessarily putting them in a position to succeed. And one thing that I've really tried to be sensitive about over the years of developing this application is the fact that we do have citizen legislators in Vermont, and that we only pay them $13,000 a year
Pretty much,
for technically 4 months of work. But as any engaged citizen knows, most Vermont legislators are willing to meet you and speak with you all 12 months of the year. So they're really being overworked and underpaid, and that's something that we wanted to be sensitive of as we designed this system to try to help streamline their workflow, as opposed to just really beat them up with noise and digital noise.
Yeah.
So we've taken great care to really craft the workflow of the application to help the three main stakeholder groups: voters, advocacy organizations, and legislators. So once you fill out the bill ID, support or oppose, choose a legislator, and then receive this call to record your message, our system does allow you to listen to your recording back before you send it, and you can even delete it and re-record your message, so folks feel comfortable with how they sound.
Right.
I have a 3-year-old, and sometimes my daughter will be crying or something will happen, and I might want to re-record my message if that's the case.
Yeah.
So again, this is about creating productive communication, not hooting and hollering at each other, but having meaningful conversations.
So why is this better than the current system that's in place, where you call the sergeant at arms office and they get the little pink slip, or you email, and you never know what exactly happens to that email.
Right.
Or just placing a regular phone call to either to the legislative's home. Sometimes they list their cell phone number.
Sure.
Some legislators do that.
Yes, they do publicly.
Yeah. You can do it. They do it right on their profile. Most of them have home numbers available. I think there's only a couple that I'm aware of that don't have a home number listed.
Right.
But most of them have, almost all of them have home phones, and some of them do have cell phones also. So what's the advantage of this system over some of the more traditional means of communication?
So I think the primary advantage is just that we're aggregating all the data under one system. So that current system that you described kind of silos all those communication channels off. So there's no way to get a high-level picture of what one particular district or even the state as a body politic thinks about a particular issue. So that's kind of the number one thing, is it puts all this data under one umbrella that provides insights to the voters and to legislators that just currently aren't available with the current system. So to kind of complete the process that we're describing, so once a constituent records that message and presses send, our system automates an email to the legislator that contains a link to the audio file of the voice message. So we're actually combining the best of both worlds, where you have the personalization of a personal phone call to one legislator, but the efficiency of the digital communication that comes through email. So certainly all those messages are now tracked and archived so that they're searchable. That legislator can go back and search them. So in the subject line of the email that the legislator receives, we provide essentially most of the pertinent information. Ben Brown has called you to support Senate Bill 123. So legislators, understanding that kind of in the moment, they might look at their phone and see an email, and they just read that subject line and say, okay, I have an idea of what this message is about, so that they don't have to actually consume the entire message on the spot to even know what it's about. And then in the body of the email, we provide the constituent's email address and phone number. If the legislator wants to just click that and get right back to them directly, then we facilitate that. And then we also let legislators, we give them an update of the statistics in their district and statewide.
Interesting.
On every email. So every email they receive is connected to a particular bill.
So they don't even have to log into the system to
There's
see.
no login at all for legislators.
So all they have to do is read the email, and it tells them, here's how many calls you've gotten on this bill.
That's right.
Here's support, here's oppose.
That's right. And here's where the district's at on this bill, right, so them. And then here's statewide, how many, what the level of support is versus the level of opposition on the bill. So
really, a legislator could even use this to hold their colleagues accountable in some ways, because
100%.
you could look at, all right, so in my district, 80% of my constituents support this bill, but statewide it's 70%. I still know that all of my colleagues probably are getting similar emails to what I'm getting, right? And they're hearing similar things because I know what the statewide statistics are.
Yeah, and that starts to touch at kind of the nuance of how interesting this layer of data that currently doesn't exist if we had this layer of data and it was publicly available, I think it just surfaces interesting questions. It doesn't necessarily answer anything definitively.
Right.
Because again...
But it helps you inform what questions to ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So going back to your point that sometimes legislators will cite a ratio of for and against that they've already heard from their constituents, this provides validating or invalidating data to those assertions. And really what that does is it just compels legislators to justify why they did or didn't vote one way in the context of how their constituents feel about that issue. And that dynamic doesn't exist right now. So again, it doesn't produce any specific outcome. It just says that, well, now everyone's going to know a little bit more, so that increases the quality of the questions that we can ask about why legislators did or didn't vote a certain way. So that's, in the, a caveat there is that, of course, New Grassroots is only tracking communications that come through New Grassroots.
Right.
So absolutely we acknowledge it's not scientifically significant, and it's not comprehensive necessarily.
Right.
But what it does indicate is these communications definitely did happen.
So it would be interesting to see, right, because to really get a picture of what's actually happening, right, it would have to be basically all communications being routed through this type of system, which almost makes it seem like an appropriate application would be for the State House to adopt the system itself, so that every call going into the State House is going through this system where they can validate the identity of the person, plug them into the right legislator, and then monitor the results. And I would assume there's also a way for constituents to know that their message was listened to.
Thank you, yes. So after the email is automated and sent to the legislator, if the legislator does click that link to listen to the audio file, our system immediately notifies the caller, hey, congratulations, your voice has been heard by your legislator. And that kind of touches on a point you had made previously as well, that there are folks, I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of Vermonters over the past couple of years about communicating with legislators. And there are a great deal of folks that report that they have sent their legislator an email previously, and they never heard anything back. So they don't know if it made it through. They don't know if the email was read or not. And that becomes frustrating for folks. And the next time that voter gets a phone call from an organization like yours that says, hey, we support this issue. If you support it as well, please contact your legislator. And often you'll hear from Vermonters, they say, well, I actually do support your issue, but I'm not going to bother emailing my legislator because I've done that in the past, and I just didn't hear anything back.
Right. It was a bad experience.
It was a bad experience.
Yeah.
And, regardless of what demographics a person fits into, income level, education level, any of these things, nobody wants to be ignored.
Right.
And it's, there's a lack of dignity there when someone takes the time to communicate and you just never hear anything back. And, to be fair, again, going back to what we said about legislators in Vermont, they're overworked and underpaid, and they're only making a quarter of a salary for full-time work.
There's an interesting analysis that was done internally in the legislature as they're talking about this $15 an hour minimum wage, and they added up all the hours that legislators spend in Montpelier, because it's supposed to be a 4-day-a-week gig, 4 months out of the year.
Right.
They're paid below the current minimum wage. Not even $15 an hour minimum wage. They're
what
paid,
is it, like $10 or something?
It's like $10.50 an hour, I think, right? Is what it is,
Sure.
and they're paid below that.
Sure.
If you add up all the hours that they spend in Montpelier.
And I mean, that's just a problem, because when we look at how important their work is to the communities they serve,
right.
I mean, should they be paid more than someone working at the cashier at a 7-Eleven?
Right.
Like, I would say yes.
Well, this is a whole nother discussion that I may not want to wade into, but it also begs the question: what kind of legislature do we want? Because the current system is incentivizing people to run who may not reflect the demographics of the state, right? Who can afford to take 4 months off from a full-time job to go to go spend 4 months in Montpelier? And the answer is, it's doctors, it's
Not
lawyers,
me.
it's people who are retired, business owners, it's people that really aren't that reflective of what the broader population is. And that's the type of legislature that we've created. It's not farmers like it used to be, and that's really what our legislative session was set up for.
Right.
This January through
Right.
May thing was really set up for farmers so that
Yeah.
they could do work in the legislature around the growing season.
Back when 80% of folks were involved in agriculture out of necessity.
And now we have,
Less than 1% of the population does farming.
right, 1% of the population does farming, and I think there's maybe one active farmer in the legislature right now. So,
Right.
just the way our legislative session is structured
Sure.
begs the question: is it reflective of Vermont as a whole?
And these are all very, very interesting questions. And when you think about how media is done these days, the 24-hour news cycle, and it's just nonstop. I mean, like trying to consume information these days is like trying to drink out of a fire hose. It's just really, really difficult. And in that context, the fact that we're not compensating legislators for the full-time work that they're putting in, I see that as a problem.
Yeah.
And as someone who's trying to lower barriers to effective engagement and also help legislators better serve and communicate with their district, I think this is something that Vermonters need to talk about and think about moving forward, is what types of demographics should be allowed to run for office. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at what the criteria are to run for office, as well as the compensation. And there's multiple strategies on how to deal with this. So some folks say, well, pay them less, cut the number of legislators, and take it from 4 months down to 3 months maybe. And then there's other schools of thought where they say, hey, maybe in this modern age we should have professional legislators, and let's pay them 50, 60 grand a year, and then actually be able to expect a high level of customer service out of these legislators.
Yeah.
And I think also another dynamic that might encourage is competition for these legislative offices. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of districts that go uncontested.
Yeah.
And I think that really factors into what we're talking about. Who can contest them?
Right.
And VPR's podcast, Brave Little State, did an episode on this topic a couple months ago, I think August or September. It talked about if our legislators are only paid $12,000 or $13,000 a year, who can be a legislator?
Right. Not many people.
Not many people.
Not me.
Not me.
Yeah.
And not any of the people I know, quite frankly. 37 years old, married. I have a 3-year-old, double income family out of necessity. And could my wife or I run for office? Like, no way. It would bankrupt our family. So you just can't do it. And that's kind of frustrating because, I love politics. Maybe that's something I would consider at some point. But I just can't financially right now.
Right.
So it's a real big issue. And I just do think that we have to be wary of both sides of this coin. Certainly a legislator ran for office, so that's a voluntary choice to be accountable to your constituents. So you can't really complain as a legislator, I think, because you ran for office. But then at the same time, there has to be limits and boundaries on what voters can ask of a legislator who's only being paid $10,000 or $15,000 a year.
So we only have about 15 minutes left. So I want to go back to what this system does, because it gives data to legislators in terms of they know who's contacting them, how many people are contacting them both for and against an issue. Yep. It gives data back to voters in terms of, hey, I know that my message was read, or I know that it wasn't read because I never got the confirmation email, right?
That's right.
So you get some positive feedback. There's no wondering whether or not it was ever read or if it mattered, right?
Yep.
But it also this also gives some tools to advocacy organizations too, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, and when you look at the existing engagement in the current system, and again, I'm speaking from personal interviews over the past several years in Vermont. Much of the current engagement is driven by the advocacy organizations. That's the role advocacy organizations play in the political ecosystem, is tracking legislation, taking legalese and breaking it down into normal language that normal folks can understand, and summarizing bills for voters, educating voters on bills, and then also inspiring voters to engage the system. So certainly when you talk about building tools for engagement, you have to include advocacy organizations. And so we provide a suite of tools for advocacy organizations to conduct and measure phone call campaigns, either for or against specific legislation. So we've run numerous kind of private pilot projects with advocacy organizations to kind of test the waters and understand how new Grassroots might integrate with the existing tools and technologies that advocacy organizations are already using. And then also kind of surfacing information from advocacy organizations about ways the system could be better, and they can even lower more barriers to increase voter engagement. So that's been really, really interesting. One of the deliverables our tools produce for advocacy organizations are reports. So if they conduct a phone call campaign that is either statewide or targeted in one particular district, they'll have a dashboard that shows real-time call statistics for how many of their supporters are placing those phone calls that they've asked them to place. And then in order to follow up with that data, we allow them to export those reports to spreadsheets so that essentially they can discuss those call statistics with the legislators. And they can be operating from a place of kind of verifiable data so that they can say, hey, you know, Senator, it looks like 25 people have called you in the past week to support this issue. Looks like maybe you've only listened to 15 of them. And we just wanted to follow up with you and get your current thoughts and see what else we need to do to get you on board.
So in a way, it could enable advocacy organizations to go in and really represent the constituents that maybe aren't being heard. So if you're one of those constituents that didn't get your voicemail listened to, hey, I know that, you know, X, Y, and Z organization is going in and trying to get questions for me.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah.
And another key to the engagement piece is, you know, the legislative process is a little bit convoluted if you don't really understand it. So most busy Vermonters don't have time to become an expert on the political process, and they need someone to indicate when is a good time to contact a legislator.
Right.
Because really you want to get the right contacts to the right legislator at the right point in the process.
Right.
So there's some logistical management that goes on, and again, this is the value that advocacy organizations bring to communities, is they track that legislation. And when they know a vote's coming up, or they know it's a key point to contact legislators, they'll usually go into their email list and send out an email to their supporters and say, hey, in the next 24 hours, we got to get calls into this legislator because their committee's about to vote on this bill.
Right.
So if you call later than 24 hours, your call won't matter.
Right, and it's interesting because it's you know, working for a statewide advocacy organization. We see this all the time where, you know, certain districts at certain times for certain bills really matter because you know, you might have one legislator that's kind of on the fence and that could flip a committee one way or the other, and then, oh, by the way, there's a vote next week. You've got to get in their district, and you've got to get in there yesterday and get them, you know, and get calls or emails or whatever you can do to put pressure on that legislator, because there's only so much you can do from inside the State House. I mean,
exactly.
You can track, you can make the best arguments possible. But if they don't see how it affects people in their district,
that's right.
You know, it's not as meaningful.
Yeah.
So I know that you're working with several organizations. You're working with Campaign for Vermont, for one, to test this out. You mentioned that. What other kind of organizations are you working with that are test driving this product and this technology, and how effective has it been so far?
Yeah. So we've worked with numerous organizations over the past 3 years. On both sides of the aisle. We've worked with advocacy organizations, and we've worked with lobbyists who serve advocacy organizations. So we've had activity on the cannabis issue, on the industrial hemp side, as well as the medical and recreational side. We've worked with agricultural organizations such as Rural Vermont on local ag stuff. I believe 2 sessions ago, actually, we worked with a farmer from southern Vermont named Jesse McDougall, who had worked with his legislator to sponsor a bill that promoted regenerative agriculture in the state. So that was a citizen-driven initiative, so not a formal organization, but we also worked with him to generate a campaign. It's one of the things that we're trying to do with this technology is democratize the ability to run a campaign. So you don't have to be a well-funded organization to start your own call campaign through New Grassroots. You can just be a motivated citizen. We're actually currently not charging any money at all for folks to run their own campaign because we're really just interested in increasing engagement and lowering those barriers. So the effectiveness, it's been really interesting because we send emails to legislators, and that email contains a link to the audio file. So there's kind of two steps to determine how the legislators are interacting with our messages. One is, are they opening the emails? So we have over 90% open rate of legislators opening the emails that come from New Grassroots. Our listen rate is about 35%. So much lower.
So there's many more people clicking on the email and opening it than they are actually listening to the voicemails.
That's right.
Interesting.
That's right. And that just raises more questions. This is really all an ongoing iterative learning process. I don't think it'll ever be done. So it's just always adding new knowledge on top of what you currently know. So the question is why? What's the impact of that? We actually think, we have some assumptions. We think that because we provide the most pertinent information in the subject line and also in the body of the email, it might be a disincentive to actually listen to the voice message.
Because you're providing so much.
That's right. Yeah. They've already characterized what bill it's on, whether it supports or opposes, and then we're giving them the aggregate data as well.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of legislators are kind of putting off listening to that actual audio file. Which there's, I don't have an opinion on that necessarily. It just raises a lot of questions.
Yeah. Well, maybe the next step is like transcribing the voice message, right?
Exactly.
So they can click and listen to it if they want to, or they can, whatever.
Click and read it.
Because I know, when I'm sitting in a committee room and I'm watching, legislators in committee rooms, typically they're sitting on their laptops. They might be checking their emails and whatever. Not the best time to play an audio file. Same's true when they're on the House floor.
Absolutely.
Everyone's got their laptops open on the House floor because that's their time to respond to emails. Right?
Sure.
And so opening up an audio file again in that setting is probably not the best.
Sure, even with headphones.
It
probably breaks decorum or whatever.
Right. So it's not always a convenient time until maybe you're back in your apartment.
That's
or you're
right.
back at your house and you're listening.
And we're even looking at interesting things to, again, try to maximize the time of legislators. So, for instance, many Vermont legislators commute, and they have decent commutes to and from if they don't rent a place in Montpelier. So we're working on things like appending all of a legislator's voice messages to an iTunes account so that they could plug that right into their vehicle.
Like a podcast.
Like a podcast, exactly. Just put it on automatic play so that as a legislator's driving, they don't have to touch their phone or do anything. You hit play once, and that'll just run through all their outstanding voice messages.
See, that's really interesting to me anyway, because I know living in Chittenden County, almost all the Chittenden, actually all of them, all the Chittenden County legislators commute to Montpelier.
Right.
It's a 35, 40-minute commute.
Right.
All of them do that.
Right.
And 35, 40 minutes, that's, for 1-minute audio files, that's 40 people that you could be listening to.
And when we look at the volume of calls legislators receive, it's a fairly low volume. This is interesting because we don't actually know how many, which is the whole point of why New Grassroots exists.
Yeah.
But it's not hundreds and hundreds of calls all the time. It's legislators report that it's not. Sometimes if there's a really popular bill that catches the news cycles, they'll get a higher volume of calls. But when you consider that legislators, deal with 400 or 500 bills, maybe vote on 200 to 300 bills, the vast majority of those bills, and I've been told this from multiple legislators, the vast majority of those bills, they actually don't hear from any constituents on. So I've been told about 80% of the bills that they vote on, they don't hear from any of their constituents.
No, but they're definitely hearing from lobbyists.
They're definitely hearing from lobbyists, probably on all of them.
Right.
Because that's what the industry does. So, fair enough. But how does that impact voters and the voters' ability to be represented? So it's about 80% of the bills, they don't hear from anyone, and then 20% of the bills they deal with, they'll hear from handfuls of legislators. So, to make this point, I've asked numerous legislators, how many constituents does it take to hear from on a specific issue to put that issue on your radar? And almost without exception, they've said 10 phone calls. So that seems like an extraordinarily low number to me. I'm one of 9 children, so I'm from a large family, and to think that me and my friends or family, just in one room at our dinner table, could influence a legislator on a bill, that's inspiring in some ways, but it's also like, wow, maybe more people need to be participating in this process.
I can tell you, working on the advocacy end of it, like 10 phone calls sounds like a lot, but it really isn't in the whole scheme of things. But it's so hard to get 10 phone calls. You know, if you had a family that all said, "Hey, we're all gonna call our legislator this week on this issue," that would be phenomenal.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Because if you think about it, if you're gonna get 10 phone calls per legislator to put it on 150 legislators' radar,
there you go.
You're talking 1,500 phone calls.
There
right?
you go. That's
right?
a win. That's a windfall of engagement.
That's like I don't think I've ever gotten 1,500 phone calls in one whole legislative session, let alone on one issue.
I know.
So you know that's a huge.
Well, and it's just so interesting for me to think about. Like I literally, you know, I'm kind of a wonk at this point, but I go to bed thinking about how many Vermonters actually call their legislator.
Right.
Like how many unique Vermonters? We have no idea.
We have no idea.
We have no idea. Could be 100. There could be one Vermonter that calls every legislator 10 times, and maybe a significant portion of all calls come from 1 or 2 Vermonters. And when you look at, you know, the issue we mentioned earlier about vocal minority and silent majority, that might even be true.
Right.
So maybe there's a handful of Vermonters who are producing a significant percentage of the volume of calls. We just don't know.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm really trying to put some data behind this, so Vermonters and legislators can really just have a more informed conversation to be more productive, to try to move away from the vitriol that's kind of infected our political process more recently, and to move more toward productive conversations about actual solutions about the most important problems facing Vermonters. That's really what we're trying to do.
So in about a minute, what's the reaction been to New Grassroots and what you're trying to do? What do legislators think? What do constituents think? What do the advocacy organizations think?
So almost hands down, voters love it. They absolutely love it. Voters don't realize that we're not tracking phone calls already. Voters do understand how difficult it is to actually contact your legislator in a way that compels some sort of response. So voters get it immediately. They love it. Most voters are fairly tech savvy at this point. So when I show them what we're doing, they kind of catch right on. They get it. They love it. They say, why isn't this the system? Advocacy organizations have a more nuanced perspective. So they absolutely love it, but they also have other technologies and tools and kind of existing workflows. And it's really about figuring out how New Grassroots integrates into the larger ecosystem that advocacy organizations work with, from technologies to tools, techniques, and all the things they kind of bring to the table to promote the views of their supporters. Legislators, I've actually had a really pleasant response from legislators. I think some legislators in Vermont actually are still not quite tech savvy. I've heard there's actually a couple legislators that don't even do email. So you have to either call their personal phone or go see them in person.
I believe that.
So that's amazing to me that there's folks that still don't even do email, but I get it. Maybe, you know, their district doesn't do email that much. So maybe that's how it works in that portion of Vermont. But for the most part, legislators actually really do want to know what their constituents think. I've had multiple legislators tell me in private and kind of in public conversations that they would absolutely love if more constituents would contact them with their opinions. So that's really encouraging. And then I've had some legislators say they really love this system and they want to kind of help be a champion and help evolve the feature sets and the benefits of this system. So overall, I would say it's been a really positive response. And really, it's introducing a new way of doing things to folks. So it takes a little bit of time for people to catch on and understand the value of the system as it compares to the existing system of today.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Ben, thank you.
I'm glad you made it on the show.
Yeah.
And for you guys who are watching, go check out, it's newgrassroots.com, correct?
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
Go check it out. Contact your legislator. We'll see you next week. And until then, keep listening beyond the sound bites.
To get started, go to newgrassroots.com. Enter your email address and zip code, and then click Take Action. You will land on a confirmation page that will tell you to check your email. You'll receive an email that will look like this. There will be a link that will say click here to verify your account. You'll be prompted to enter a password, first and last name, address, the phone number that you want to use for recording your message. You'll also be prompted to enter a PIN. You will also be asked if you want to join the new Grassroots mailing list. You will be redirected to your dashboard, which will display your call statistics and the legislators that are in your legislative district for both the House and the Senate. Click on the Organizations tab and then search for Campaign for Vermont. Click the Join button on the right-hand side of the page. Click the button to confirm. Campaign for Vermont is now added to your organizations page. Anytime a call to action is issued, you will receive a notification email, and there will be a pop-up that will appear on your dashboard. On your home page, you'll be notified that a call to action has been issued. Click the link to record a message. Select which legislator you'd like to leave a message for, and then click Call Me Now. New Grassroots will call your phone and prompt you to record a voicemail message.
Calling VP State Legislator Mary Sullivan to support Go number S.8. Begin recording your message after the beep. Click the pound button when finished.
Hi, I'm calling because I'd like you to support S8, the ethics bill.
Press 1 to send your message. Press 2 to listen to your message. Press 3 to re-record.
Press 1 to send your message. You'll then receive an email confirmation that your message has been sent. From your account dashboard, you'll be able to see if the legislator you sent a message to has opened it and listened to it. Thank you for watching this tutorial. We're excited to be partnering with New Grassroots to bring you another way to contact your legislator. If you'd like more information, you can find it on their website at newgrassroots.com.